What chance did a Cheyenne woman have when she fell into the hands of the very soldiers who had just slaughtered her people? On November 29th, 1864, the sun rose over Sand Creek in what is now the Colorado Territory. 15-year-old Mochi awoke to a scene of terror. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves. Soldiers poured into the Cheyenne and Arapaho camp, rifles firing, sabers flashing. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 150 Native people lay dead, the majority of them women, children, and the elderly. Mochi saw her mother shot before her eyes. Relatives fell around her, cut down without mercy. Soldiers stormed through the lodges, tearing down teepees and setting them aflame. In the chaos, one soldier attacked her. She fought back. She seized a revolver and fired. The soldier fell. In that single moment, she sealed her fate. The army marked her as dangerous, not just another survivor to be driven off, but someone to be captured, contained, and broken. In the months that followed, Mochi was taken under military guard. First, she was moved between encampments, and then eventually shipped halfway across the continent. She ended up in Fort Marion, Florida, a converted Spanish fortress that now served as a prison for native captives of the Indian Wars. The official records describe her simply, prisoner of war. They say nothing about the hunger that gnawed at her day after day, nothing about the damp walls and stifling heat of the old stone cells, nothing about the isolation of being a teenage girl thousands of miles from home, with no certainty she would ever return. Mochi's name is unusual in one respect. We remember it. For most Native American women captured during the westward expansion, history leaves no such marker. They vanish into silence. There was no trial to record, no testimony to preserve. Their fates were decided behind closed doors or in the field, and whatever happened next was rarely written down. Yet scraps of evidence survive. Letters from missionaries hint at troubling circumstances. Military reports speak of women in custody, without explaining why or where they ended up. Oral histories passed down through Native families recall daughters, sisters, and mothers taken away, never seen again. These fragments reveal a grim truth. Captivity for Native women was not a single uniform fate. A woman could be forced into servitude in a settler's home, married off against her will, locked inside an institution, or moved far from her homeland to live under military control. Some were paraded in public as trophies. Others were hidden away, their existence barely acknowledged. Sexual violence and enslavement. For many Native women, the most immediate danger after capture did not come in the heat of battle, but in its shadow. When soldiers, settlers, or armed militias swept through Native camps, the violence did not always end with the gunfire. In the 1850s and 1860s, frontier newspapers occasionally hinted at this reality, though rarely in plain language. Reports of immoral conduct in military forts or improper treatment of women under guard were thinly veiled references to abuse. Missionary letters from Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakota Territory used phrases like indecent liberties or compromised situations when describing what befell women taken for their protection. California, during the gold rush, offers some of the clearest evidence. Native women, especially from smaller tribes devastated by disease and violence, were taken into mining camps under the pretense of marriage. Prospectors openly spoke of wife markets in towns like Shasta and Nevada City, where women could be claimed by paying a fee to the man who had captured them. These so-called marriages had no legal standing, no ceremony, and certainly no consent from the women involved. Many lasted only until the man tired of the arrangement or found another partner. The military was equally complicit. In the aftermath of the Modoc War in the early 1870s, captured Modoc women were brought to Fort Klamath. Official records list them as dependents of the surrendered warriors, but oral accounts from the Modoc people suggest that several were subjected to unwanted attention from soldiers and civilian contractors. Borderlands ranches and remote homesteads created their own form of captivity. A woman taken in a raid might find herself living in a settler's household, not as a guest, but as part of the property. In Texas and New Mexico, some settlers openly spoke of keeping Native women. The relationships were framed as domestic partnerships, but the imbalance of power was total. For a Native woman in the 19th century West, the law offered almost no protection. In many territories, she could not testify against a white man in court. Even if she did, her words carried little weight in the eyes of a jury steeped in racial prejudice. Accusations could be dismissed as lies or as the product of uncivilized misunderstanding. The risk of retaliation was high. Survival often meant silence. Some women endured years of mistreatment, calculating that staying alive, and perhaps protecting their children, was worth the personal cost. Others attempted escape, only to be hunted down or forced back into captivity. The official histories do not record their names or their struggles, but the patterns, repeated in region after region, tell us this was no rare occurrence. It was part of the fabric of frontier conquest. Forced domestic roles. Captivity on the frontier did not always involve prison walls, chains, or military guards. More often, it meant a lifetime of unpaid, unacknowledged labor inside a settler's home. In 1850, California passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. Despite its name, the law legalized the forced apprenticeship of Native Americans, including women and children. Under the Act, settlers could petition local officials to bind a Native person to their household for a term of service. In theory, these terms had limits: 4 months for adults, until adulthood for children. In practice, the contracts were renewable, and many lasted for years or even decades. This system blurred the line between servitude and slavery. A captured woman could be declared an apprentice and sent to live with a family she had never met. She might work from dawn until long after dark, cooking, cleaning, tending livestock, and caring for children, all without pay. If she refused, she risked beatings, starvation, or being sent to an even harsher household. Newspaper records from the 1850s and 1860s show advertisements for Indian girls available for domestic work. In some cases, these ads came from sheriffs or officials, suggesting the women had been seized during raids or arrests. Once placed in a household, their movements were strictly controlled. Leaving without permission could be considered theft of labor, leading to recapture. In Texas, New Mexico, and parts of the Southwest, the arrangement took on a different name: the squaw household. White men, often ranchers or traders, lived with Native women in relationships that combined domestic labor with coerced intimacy. These men were sometimes called squaw men by their neighbors, a term meant to ridicule them for crossing racial lines. But within the home, the imbalance of power was absolute. The woman had no recognized legal status, no rights to property, and no say in the arrangement. Some settlers saw these relationships as a form of rescue. They claimed the women were safer under their roof than in so-called wild conditions. But oral histories from tribes like the Mescalero Apache and the Ute tell a different story. One of women living under constant supervision, cut off from their families, and expected to serve without complaint. Even when there was no overt cruelty, the captivity was complete. Census records from the late 19th century often reduced these women to a single phrase: Indian servant or domestic help. Their real names, tribal affiliations, and personal histories vanish from the page. For many, their pre-capture lives might as well have never existed in the eyes of official history. In some households, the woman's labor was so central that the settler family could not function without her. She cooked every meal, mended every shirt, hauled water, milked cows, and kept the fire burning through winter nights. And yet, she might sleep on the floor of the kitchen or in a shed outside. The work was invisible to anyone outside the household, but it was relentless. For those who tried to leave, options were limited. A woman who escaped risked being hunted down by local law enforcement, or by the settler who claimed her. If she made it back to her community, she might find her people scattered, displaced, or confined to reservations. Forced domestic roles were less visible than open imprisonment, but they were no less a form of control. They folded conquest into the routines of daily life, turning women into the quiet, unseen machinery of settler survival. And because this captivity happened inside private homes, it left even fewer traces in the historical record. Child removal and assimilation. For young Native women and girls, capture often meant a deeper kind of loss, not just of freedom, but of family, language, and identity. Unlike adult captives, whose fates were often tied to labor or coerced partnerships, children were prime targets for removal and assimilation. Sometimes, the process was immediate and brutally public. After a battle or massacre, survivors, especially girls, might be separated from their families on the spot. In some cases, younger children were handed over to white families in nearby settlements under the banner of adoption. The word adoption sounded charitable, but these placements rarely had the legal protections of guardianship. A girl taken in this way would be given a new name, new clothes, and a new religion, and she would be expected to grow up as if her former life had never existed. One of the most notorious examples comes from the aftermath of the Whitman Massacre in 1847 in what is now Washington State. After the killing of missionary Marcus Whitman and others by Cayuse warriors, an event rooted in tensions over land, disease, and cultural conflict, a number of Native and mixed heritage children in the area were taken in by settler families. Official records framed these actions as rescue. Cayuse oral histories describe them as abduction. By the late 19th century, this kind of informal adoption was joined by something far more systematic: the boarding school system. Spearheaded by figures like Captain Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the policy was explicit: kill the Indian, save the man. Girls sent to these schools were often taken hundreds of miles from their homes. Their hair, a source of cultural pride in many tribes, was cut short. They were assigned English names. Their traditional clothing was replaced with stiff uniforms. Speaking their own language was punished, sometimes with physical discipline. Religious services were mandatory, and Native spiritual practices were strictly forbidden. The education these girls received was deliberately narrow. Alongside basic reading and arithmetic, they were trained in sewing, cooking, laundry, and other domestic tasks, skills designed to prepare them for a life of service in white households. The idea was not just to assimilate them, but to make them economically dependent on the very society that had taken them. Mission homes for rescued Native women operated under similar principles. In places like Santa Fe and Albuquerque, church-run institutions took in girls and young women, claiming to offer shelter and moral guidance. In reality, they often functioned as halfway points between capture and placement in settler homes, reinforcing strict Victorian gender roles and Christian doctrine. Historical accounts from these mission homes reveal the same patterns seen in boarding schools: the suppression of language, the breaking of cultural ties, and the reshaping of identity to fit a colonial mold. One Presbyterian mission report from the 1880s describes remarkable progress in teaching Native girls the ways of civilized womanhood. What it does not mention is that this progress was achieved by erasing everything those girls had been before. For many, this was a captivity without bars. The walls were ideological, not physical, but the confinement was just as real. The goal was not simply to house these girls, it was to ensure they never returned to the life they had known. In that sense, child removal and assimilation were among the most enduring forms of conquest, stretching long past the battlefields and into the daily lives of generations. Forced marriages and reproductive control. Marriage on the 19th century frontier was often less about romance and more about survival. For Native American women taken during the westward expansion, it could be a survival strategy they never chose. A captured woman might be claimed by a settler, trader, or soldier as his wife. The claim was sometimes backed by an informal agreement with local authorities, or simply enforced by the man's will. In the absence of her community's protection, and with no legal standing in the settler's court system, refusal was rarely an option. The language of the time often masked the reality. In territorial newspapers, such unions were sometimes described as protection marriages or civilizing arrangements. In practice, they bound a woman to a man who held complete control over her movements, her labor, and, crucially, her body. Historical records from the New Mexico Territory in the 1860s and 1870s tell of Native women married to traders along the Santa Fe Trail. These relationships often began with capture during a raid or trading expedition. Some women bore children in these unions, but the stability of the arrangement depended entirely on the man's goodwill. If he abandoned her, she had no legal claim to property, custody, or even the right to remain in the settlement. By the late 19th century, reproductive control over Native women took a far more calculated turn. Reservation hospitals, many run under federal oversight, began performing medical procedures aimed at limiting Native birth rates. The earliest documented cases of sterilization of Native women appear in the 1890s. While the practice was not yet as widespread as it would become in the 20th century, the roots of the policy mindset were already there. The belief that reducing Native populations was both moral and practical. Consent in these cases was dubious at best. Some women were told the procedure was necessary for their health after childbirth. Others were not informed at all. In an era when most Native people had little access to independent medical advice and were dependent on government or mission-run facilities, questioning a doctor's recommendation was nearly impossible. The combination of forced marriage and reproductive control was devastating. Forced marriage tied women into relationships where they were expected to produce children to serve the household or community of the captor. Sterilization cut off the possibility of future children altogether, erasing family lines before they could begin. Both tactics served the same purpose: to disrupt the continuity of Native families and weaken the foundations of Native nations. Whether through coerced union or medical intervention, the control of Native women's reproductive lives was a calculated tool in the conquest of the West. Mass violence and public erasure. For some Native women, capture was not the end of violence. It was a pause before the final act. On the frontier, massacres were often justified in official reports as pacification or necessary measures. The language was cold and bureaucratic, but the reality was brutal. In more than one recorded case, pregnant women and mothers with infants were specifically targeted, not just as individuals, but as symbols of the community's future. Eliminating them was seen as a way to break the cycle of resistance, by ensuring fewer children would grow up to fight. The Sand Creek Massacre, where Mochi's story began, is one example. Witnesses testified that soldiers attacked women who had tried to signal surrender. The 1870 Marias Massacre in Montana followed a similar pattern. U.S. troops descended on a camp of mostly women, children, and the elderly, killing more than 170 people. Survivors reported that women were pursued even as they fled into the snow. But mass violence was not only physical, it could also be public and performative. In the decades after major conflicts, Native women were sometimes put on display as living symbols of conquest. Wild West shows, popular in the late 19th century, often featured Native women as part of their spectacle. Some participated voluntarily, seeking wages or travel. Others were brought in under pressure from reservation agents or show managers. They were dressed either in their own traditional clothing or in exaggerated costumes meant to amuse white audiences. In the show's narrative, these women were often depicted as tamed, standing beside white performers to illustrate the supposed triumph of civilization. Missionary fairs and exhibitions had their own version of display. Here, Native women might be shown sewing, weaving, or cooking, framed as examples of how Christian instruction could transform so-called savage lives. the message was clear. This was the proper place for Native women, not as leaders or free members of their own communities, but as humble workers under the supervision of white society. Even within reservations, public erasure was paired with private deprivation. Food rations could be withheld as punishment for non-compliance. Medical care could be denied. Travel passes could be refused, preventing women from visiting relatives in other communities. Officials described these measures as discipline, but they were part of a larger strategy to control every aspect of life. In the historical record, the erasure is almost complete. Many of these women's names were never written down. In some cases, they appear only in the background of photographs, unidentified. In others, they are mentioned briefly in reports, an Indian woman or a squaw taken at the raid, before disappearing from the page entirely. This erasure was not accidental. It was the final stage of conquest, to make the person vanish not only from the land, but from memory. And yet, in family oral histories, in stories passed quietly from grandmother to granddaughter, fragments survive. They remind us that behind every nameless figure in a report or photograph was a life as complex and human as any other. A life marked by resilience, endurance, and the refusal to be entirely forgotten. These fates were not isolated events. They were overlapping strategies in a century-long campaign to dismantle Native communities by targeting their women. The historical record is patchy by design. What survives is enough to know that these outcomes were not rare accidents, but part of a broader pattern that stretched from the first forts of the West to the last days of the open frontier. In the shadows of forts, in the kitchens of ranch houses, in the classrooms of boarding schools, and in the dust of exhibition arenas, Native women lived and endured. Some survived to tell their stories, most did not. And in that silence, the true cost of conquest is still being counted.